Welcome to the deep dive. If you are tuning in today, you are likely staring down a very specific, pretty high stakes challenge right now.
You're prepping for the AP Human Geography exam.
Exactly.
Right.
And you need to master Unit 5, which is Agriculture and Rural Land Use Patterns and Processes. So, that is our sole mission today.
It's a big one.
It is a massive. We have this towering stack of curriculum notes, executive summaries, illustrative case studies right here on the table. And we're going to filter all of this so you don't have to just glare at a textbook until your eyes cross.
Right, because the stakes here are actually really significant for you. Unit 5 accounts for somewhere between 12 to 17% of your entire AP exam in May.
That is a huge chunk.
It's a critical hurdle, but we are not going to just, throw a dictionary of vocabulary words at you to memorize.
No, please no.
Rote memorization won't save you when you get to the free response questions, the FRQs. My goal today is to give you the cheat codes for this unit.
I love that.
We are going to connect the dots to really understand the why and the where of global agriculture. We want to analyze these concepts so deeply that you can tackle literally any obscure prompt they throw your way.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to transform what might seem like incredibly dense AP concepts into a really fascinating global journey.
It really is a fascinating topic once you get into it.
It totally is. And by the time we finish this deep dive, I promise you are going to look at the food in your refrigerator and honestly the entire world map completely differently.
Absolutely.
So we're breaking this down into 4 clear segments today. We've got the historical foundations, the spatial patterns, the modern global economy, and finally the environmental and social impacts of, well, how we feed humanity.
It is a lot of ground to cover. But if you understand the underlying logic of these systems, the exam questions essentially answer themselves.
Let's start right at the bedrock then with segment 1, which is agricultural foundations and historical revolutions. To kick us off, we need to figure out what we are even talking about here. What is the working definition of agriculture?
At its most basic, agriculture is the deliberate modification of Earth's surface through the cultivation of plants and the rearing of animals to obtain sustenance or economic gain.
Deliberate modification.
Right. It is humanity deciding not to just wander and search for food, but to actually engineer the environment to produce it on command.
But I'm guessing I can't just, walk outside anywhere on Earth and start a farm. Like, I can't grow avocados in Antarctica.
You definitely cannot. And that brings us to a really foundational geographic concept, which is environmental determinism.
Okay, let's define that.
This is the idea that the physical environment strictly dictates the viability of certain human activities, like farming. You really have to look at 2 primary physical factors before you even plant a single seed.
Which are?
Soil quality and topography.
Okay, let's break those down. What does perfect soil actually look like?
Well, think about the Great Plains of the United States. You have incredibly deep, nutrient-rich topsoil there that has been built up over literally millennia.
Right.
It can support sweeping, large-scale crop production year after year after year. Now, compare that to the Sahara Desert, or as you mentioned, Antarctica, which is entirely non-arable.
The dirt literally just cannot support the biology of a crop.
Exactly. And then you have topography, which is just the shape of the land.
Like hills versus flat ground.
Correct. Flat plains allow for massive fields of wheat or corn. You can run heavy machinery over them easily. But what if you live in the rugged, steep, rocky terrains of Scotland or the hills of Ireland?
You can't exactly plant 1,000 acres of row crops on a cliff.
No, the tractors would roll over and all your soil would just wash away in the rain anyway.
Yeah.
So how does humanity adapt to that? They use that rugged physical landscape for livestock grazing.
Oh, because animals don't care about the angle of the hill?
Right. Sheep and goats don't mind walking up a steep incline to eat grass.
That makes perfect sense. So the land itself is the first filter. And I'm assuming climate is the second massive piece of the puzzle here.
It is.
And the sources emphasize that we're talking about long-term weather patterns here, right? Not just checking the daily forecast on your phone.
Yes, long-term climate classifications completely shape what crops are historically possible in a specific region. We can look at a few major zones that you'll need to know. First, you have the tropical climate.
That's so hot.
Warm year-round with high precipitation, generally sitting about 20 degrees north and south of the equator. We're talking about Central America, South Asia, or the Amazon basin.
So what grows in a place that is essentially a permanent giant greenhouse?
That is where you see the heavy cultivation of things like rice, sugarcane, and tropical cash crops, your coffee and your cocoa.
Yeah.
The constant heat and moisture are perfect for them.
Makes sense.
But conversely, look at dry climates. These include arid deserts and semi-arid zones like the steppes of Central Asia or parts of the Middle East. They have incredibly low, very unpredictable precipitation.
Farming crops there sounds like a massive gamble. If the rain just doesn't come one year, you lose everything.
It is a profound risk. So human adaptation in dry climates leans heavily into nomadic herding and raising livestock.
Because animals have legs.
Exactly. Animals can be moved to wherever the scarce water and grass happen to be during that particular season. Then you have moderate climates, which have average temperatures around 75 degrees, really abundant, reliable precipitation.
So this is like the eastern United States.
Right, or parts of Western Europe. This
Yeah.
is ideal for general large-scale crop production.
There is a specific subtype of the moderate climate mentioned in the notes, though, that seems to be an AP grader favorite, the Mediterranean climate. What makes this one so special?
The Mediterranean climate is unique and highly localized. It features hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters with abundant sunshine.
Obviously around the Mediterranean Sea.
Like Italy and Greece, yes. But you also find distinct pockets of it in coastal California, central Chile, South Africa, and parts of Australia.
And because of that really specific weather rhythm, it produces a very specific type of food, right?
Yes, this is the global heartland for horticulture. It is where you get olives, grapes for wine, figs, and citrus fruits. These crops thrive in that dry summer heat just as long as they get that winter moisture.
Okay, so physical geography and climate set the stage. They essentially deal the cards. But how people play that hand brings us to two terms the listener absolutely must know for this exam: intensive versus extensive agriculture.
Very important distinction.
Let's see if I have this right. Imagine I have a tiny 5 by 5 foot apartment balcony in a crowded city, and I want to grow as many tomatoes as humanly possible.
Okay.
I'm going to buy premium soil, set up drip irrigation, buy special fertilizers, and spend hours pruning and tying up those tomato vines every single day to maximize that tiny space. Is that a good way to think about intensive agriculture?
That is a perfect analogy. Intensive agriculture is all about maximizing the yield from a very small plot of land. To do that, you have to apply high inputs of labor, capital, or technology.
You are intensely managing every square inch.
Exactly.
And what does that look like on a real-world commercial scale?
It takes a few specific forms that you will definitely see on the exam. The first is market gardening, sometimes called truck farming.
Truck farming.
Yeah, it happens heavily in places like California or near major urban centers on the East Coast. It's relatively small scale geographically, heavily focused on perishable fruits, vegetables, and flowers.
High-value stuff.
Right. It requires high investments in things like greenhouses, specialized fertilizers, and a lot of manual labor for picking delicate fruits.
Now, the sources also list plantation agriculture under the intensive category, which honestly surprised me. When I think of a plantation, I think of thousands of acres. How is that intensive?
It is a great distinction to make. Plantation agriculture is large-scale commercial farming, usually focused on a single cash crop like coffee, tea, rubber, or sugarcane.
And mostly in developing countries, right?
Yes, heavily in peripheral or semi-peripheral countries. But it is classified as intensive because it requires staggering human labor inputs. You can't really harvest tea leaves or tap rubber trees with the giant automated tractor.
Oh, I see. It requires an intense, concentrated workforce to manually work the land.
Exactly. It's about the ratio of labor applied to the land.
Got it. What about mixed crop and livestock systems?
You see this in traditional farming in places like France or the American Midwest. The farmer grows crops and raises animals on the exact same farm.
Which sounds like a lot of work.
It is. It requires intense labor and management to run this symbiotic cycle. The farmer grows corn, the corn is fed to the pigs produce manure, and the manure is intensely managed and spread back onto the fields to fertilize the next crop of corn. Okay, so let's flip my balcony analogy. If intensive is micromanaging a tiny space, extensive agriculture must be like buying a 100-acre lot of cheap land in the middle of nowhere, throwing a bag of wildflower seeds into the wind, and just letting nature do its thing with minimal interference from me.
Basically, yes. Extensive agriculture uses lower inputs of labor and capital per unit of land.
Because you have the space to spare.
Right. It usually occurs in sparsely populated areas where land is cheap or where the soil is maybe less fertile, requiring the crops or animals to spread out over a vast area just to find enough nutrients to survive.
The notes highlight shifting cultivation as a prime example of this. Can you walk us through how that actually works in practice?
Shifting cultivation, specifically the slash and burn method, is heavily practiced in tropical regions like the Amazon basin or parts of Central Africa.
Why there?
Well, the soil in rainforests is actually surprisingly poor in nutrients. All the life is in the trees themselves. So farmers cut down a patch of vegetation and burn it.
And the ash becomes the fertilizer.
Yes, the ash acts as a temporary, rich fertilizer for the soil. They farm that patch for a few years until the heavy rains wash the nutrients away and the soil is depleted again.
And then what?
Then they simply abandon that plot, let the forest regrow over a long period, and move on to slash and burn a new, extensive area of land.
It requires a massive amount of land because you are constantly rotating which part of it you are actually using at any given time.
Exactly.
What about animals in an extensive system?
You have nomadic herding, which we touched on slightly with dry climates. In places like Mongolia or the Arabian Peninsula, herders move their domesticated animals across expansive, arid pasture lands following seasonal rains.
Because there's not enough grass in one spot to keep them fed all year.
Right. It is an extensive use of land because it takes hundreds of square miles to support a single herd.
And the commercial version of that would be ranching.
It's exactly right. Commercial ranching is raising livestock over vast tracts of land for meat or wool. Unlike nomadic herding, ranching is stationary. The farmer owns the land, and it is designed for global market profit.
Like Texas.
Think of the sweeping ranches in Texas, the pampas of Argentina, or the outback of Australia. The animals roam extensively to graze.
Okay, so that gives us a really solid foundational map of where and how we farm. Now, we need to travel back in time to understand when humanity actually figured all this out. The AP exam focuses heavily on the 3 agricultural revolutions.
This is a massive topic for the exam.
Let's look at the first agricultural revolution, topic 5.3. We are going way back, roughly to 10,000 BCE. What exactly happened?
This is perhaps the most important demographic pivot in human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers. We followed the food. The first agricultural revolution is the monumental shift from that nomadic foraging to deliberate plant and animal domestication. People realized that if they dropped seeds in the ground, plants grew. If they fenced in wild, docile animals, they could breed them.
And the wild part about this, according to the notes, is that it wasn't just one genius who figured it out and told everyone else. It happened independently all over the globe.
That is the concept of independent agricultural hearths. Human populations in completely different geographic regions figured out domestication entirely independent of one another, separated by oceans and mountains.
And for the exam, you need to know these specific hearths and what they grew.
You absolutely do.
Let's run through them.
In the Fertile Crescent of Southwest Asia, modern-day Iraq and Syria, they domesticated wheat and barley alongside sheep, goats, and cattle.
Okay, that's the Middle East. What about South Asia?
Over in the Indus River Valley in South Asia, the focus was wheat, cotton, and cattle. In Southeast Asia, the climate dictated a different path. They domesticated rice, sugarcane, and pigs.
And the Americas.
In Mesoamerica, or Central America, they domesticated maize, which we call corn beans, and squash. Down in the Andes of South America, they focused on potatoes and llamas.
So why does this matter so much? I mean, obviously it's nice to have a reliable meal, but what did the surplus of food actually allow humans to do?
It allowed them to stay in one place. Once you have a reliable food surplus, you don't have to spend every waking hour searching for berries.
You have free time.
Yes, that surplus frees up a portion of the population to do things other than hunt. This leads directly to the birth of civilization as we know it. You get permanent settlements, you get labor specialization.
Meaning not everyone has to be a farmer.
Exactly. Some people farm, but others become blacksmiths, priests, or politicians. You get the development of writing systems, just to keep track of grain inventories. You get the first city-states.
But those crops didn't stay locked in their independent hearths forever. They spread. They diffused. And the sources point to the 15th and 16th centuries as the ultimate agricultural crossover episode, the Columbian Exchange.
The Columbian Exchange was a staggering, transformative transfer of biological resources, plants, animals, and diseases between the Americas and the Afro-Eurasian landmass following Christopher Columbus's voyages.
I think we often learn about this in history class as just a list of items crossing an ocean, like tomatoes went here, horses went there. But how did it actually change human geography?
The demographic impacts were profound. Let's look at the potato and maize moving from the Americas to Europe. The potato, in particular, could grow in the rocky, cold soils of northern Europe and Ireland, where traditional wheats struggle.
And it's super filling.
Incredibly nutrient-dense. Because the caloric output of European farms skyrocketed, European diets improved dramatically. This directly fueled a massive population boom in Europe.
A completely new food source literally created millions of new people.
It did. And conversely, Europeans brought wheat, pigs, cattle, and horses to the Americas.
The horse seems like a big one.
The introduction of the horse is a phenomenal geographical case study. It entirely revolutionized the societies of indigenous plains communities in North America. Nations like the Comanche or the Lakota integrated the horse, completely changing their transportation, their hunting capabilities for bison, and their territorial reach. The landscape was forever altered by the arrival of these new species.
Let's fast forward a few centuries then. Humanity has been farming with manual labor and animal power for thousands of years. Then we hit the second agricultural revolution, peaking between the 17th and 19th centuries.
Right.
And you really cannot understand this revolution without linking it directly to the Industrial Revolution. They are a matched pair.
They feed into each other in a continuous loop. The second agricultural revolution is where we move away from purely manual human labor and enter the era of mechanization and scientific land management.
The factories build the tools for the farms.
Exactly. The technology emerging from the early Industrial Revolution provided the tools that made farming exponentially more productive.
Give me some examples of these tools. How did they actually change the daily life of a farmer?
Let's look at Jethro Tull's seed drill. Before this, farmers literally walked through a field broadcasting or just throwing seeds by hand. It was wildly inefficient.
Because they land everywhere.
Birds ate the seeds, the wind blew them away, and crops grew in chaotic clusters. The mechanical seed drill planted seeds at specific depths in perfectly straight rows.
Which seems like a small aesthetic change, but I'm guessing it had a huge impact on yield.
A staggering impact. Straight rows meant you could run a horse-drawn hoe between the plants to rip out weeds without destroying the crop itself. Yield skyrocketed.
And what else?
You also had John Deere's steel plow, which could cut through the thick, tough root systems of the American prairie, opening up millions of acres of new land that wooden plows just couldn't handle. And mechanical reapers increased harvesting efficiency tenfold.
The notes also mention scientific land management, specifically the four-field crop rotation system. How did that work?
Historically, if you grew wheat on a field for several years, it sucked all the nitrogen out of the soil. The farmer would have to leave the field empty or fallow for a year just to let it recover.
That is wasted land.
Exactly. The four-field rotation introduced crops like turnips and clover into the rotation cycle. Clover naturally pulls nitrogen from the air and fixes it back into the soil.
So you never had to leave a field empty.
Never. You grew wheat, then turnips to feed livestock over winter, then barley, then clover to heal the soil. It maximized land use to 100% capacity.
So we have straight rows, steel plows, and soil that never gets tired. What does this all mean for the human population?
This is the critical demographic shift you need to grasp for the AP exam. Because these new machines and techniques meant you needed far fewer humans working the fields to produce even more food, millions of rural farm workers suddenly found themselves obsolete.
They didn't have jobs anymore. Where did they go?
They migrated to the cities. This massive rural-to-urban migration provided the essential, cheap labor force needed to work in the new factories of the Industrial Revolution.
The farms fed the cities and provided the workers.
The second agricultural revolution fed the cities, and it provided the workers for the cities. Furthermore, because food production spiked so dramatically, diets improved, and life expectancies rose across the board.
It sounds like it essentially thwarted the Malthusian crisis. We hear about Thomas Malthus predicting that population growth would eventually outpace our ability to grow food, leading to mass famine. But the machines beat the math.
Temporarily, yes.
Mm.
The mechanization, combined with new transportation like trains and canals that allowed massive food supplies to be shipped to urban centers before spoiling, kept famine at bay in the developed world.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the Green Revolution, also known as the Third Agricultural Revolution. This takes place primarily from the 1940s to the 1970s. We've gone from human labor to machines. Now the focus shifts entirely to a scientific, chemical, and heavily engineered technology package.
The Green Revolution was fundamentally a response to a looming crisis. Populations in the developing world were exploding in the mid-20th century, and traditional farming couldn't keep up. The revolution was driven by the creation of high-yield hybrid seeds, primarily wheat, rice, and maize.
The notes mention Norman Borlaug. Who is he, and what did he do with these seeds?
Norman Borlaug was an American agronomist. He went to Mexico and spent years crossbreeding different strains of wheat. He eventually engineered a dwarf variety of wheat.
Well, dwarf.
Well, traditional wheat grew very tall, and when it developed heavy grain heads, the wind would blow it over, ruining the crop. Borlaug's dwarf wheat had a short, thick stalk that could support massive amounts of grain without falling over. It was disease-resistant and grew incredibly fast.
But these miracle seeds didn't just grow on their own right. They came with strings attached.
They required an intense package of inputs to survive and thrive. They needed massive amounts of synthetic, petroleum-based fertilizers to fuel that rapid growth. They needed chemical pesticides to protect them from insects. And they required expansive new irrigation systems because they demanded far more water than traditional crops.
Before we go further, I want to clarify a distinction that the curriculum calls out explicitly. The Green Revolution was about crossbreeding plants. It was not about laboratory-engineered GMOs or genetically modified organisms.
That is a vital distinction for the exam. The Green Revolution was traditional, albeit highly advanced, scientific crossbreeding, taking pollen from one plant and putting it on another. True GMOs, where scientists literally spliced DNA from a fish into a tomato in a laboratory, didn't come onto the commercial scene until the 1990s.
So how did this crossbreeding package spread across the globe?
The diffusion was heavily hierarchical. The research and funding originated in core, developed countries like the United States, and the technology was exported to periphery and semi-periphery nations that were teetering on the edge of massive food insecurity. Places like India, Mexico, Indonesia, and the Philippines.
And it worked. I mean, Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize. It averted massive famines in India and Mexico. It lowered global food prices for half a century. But when I read the case studies, it's clear this came with incredibly steep, uneven costs.
This is a classic AP FRQ setup. What were the long-term consequences of the Green Revolution? On paper, it saved 1 billion lives. But environmentally, the costs were severe. The practice of double cropping, planting more than one crop a year on the same land to maximize the miracle seeds, led to intense soil degradation.
And what about all those chemicals they had to use?
The environmental fallout was tragic. The massive reliance on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides caused terrible water pollution and toxic runoff. We see places like the Punjab region in India, which was the poster child for the Green Revolution's success, now experiencing severe ecological and public health crises due to decades of intense chemical exposure in their groundwater.
The social disruption seems just as profound. I was reading about how it impacted traditional gender roles.
Yes. In many traditional subsistence societies, women provided the bulk of agricultural labor and possessed generations of localized farming knowledge. But when the Green Revolution arrived, it brought tractors, chemical training, and international aid workers.
And who got the training?
That new education, the access to credit, and the power of the machinery were almost exclusively handed to men, effectively marginalizing women and pushing them out of their traditional economic roles.
There's also a brutal economic trap built into this system. Small-scale farmers had practiced the ancient tradition of saving seeds from this year's harvest to plant next year. But you can't really do that with these hybrid seeds, can you?
You cannot. Many of these high-yield seeds were designed to yield significantly less in their second generation, or they were legally patented by massive agricultural corporations.
So they have to buy them again.
Every single year. So small farmers became trapped. They were crippled by a dependency on buying corporate seed patents, plus they had to buy the expensive chemical fertilizers required to make them grow. The wealthy, large-scale farmers who could afford the inputs thrived and bought up more land, while the small subsistence farmers were often driven into debt and forced off their land completely.
So, for the listener preparing for the AP exam, let's synthesize segment 1. You need to be able to compare these 3 revolutions. Think of it as a ladder. The first revolution created settlements and civilization. The second revolution fueled the Industrial Revolution and massive urban migration. And the third revolution temporarily solved global hunger through science, but introduced devastating environmental degradation and corporate dependency. If you can articulate those long-term impacts clearly, you have mastered the historical foundations.
That is the exact analytical framework you need.
Let's pivot now to segment 2, spatial patterns, surveying, and land use models. We've talked about the timeline of farming. Now let's look at how farming literally physically shapes the surface of the earth. If you were sitting in a window seat on a cross-country flight and you look down at a rural area, you don't just see random houses scattered anywhere.
No, you see distinct, deliberate geometric patterns of human settlement.
According to Topic 5.2, there are 3 primary rural settlement patterns: clustered, dispersed, and linear.
Let's start with clustered, or nucleated settlements. Imagine a bullseye. The homes, barns, and community buildings are grouped very tightly together in the center, usually around a focal point, like a church, a marketplace, or a village green. The farmland itself surrounds this dense center, meaning farmers have to walk or commute outward to their fields every morning.
We build like that. It seems inefficient to walk a mile to your tractor every single day.
Historically, it was a matter of survival. It was about social cohesion and defense. If your region was prone to bandit raids or warfare, a tight cluster of homes was much easier to defend than isolated cabins. You also see this heavily in traditional European villages, parts of Latin America, and agricultural regions in Asia, where sharing communal resources like a central well or a grain mill was essential.
Contrast that with dispersed or isolated settlements. When I picture this, I see the classic American Midwest aesthetic. You have one farmhouse sitting alone in the middle of a massive 500-acre plot of land, and the nearest neighbor is a mile down the road.
Precisely. You only build a dispersed settlement if you have a foundational assumption of safety and abundant resources. You don't need to huddle behind a village wall for protection. So families prioritize owning vast amounts of contiguous land to maximize their commercial output. Privacy and land ownership supersede communal defense.
And the third pattern is linear settlements. This one is highly visually distinct.
Just as it sounds, buildings are arranged in a long, narrow line, almost always hugging a critical geographic feature like a river, a coastline, or a major transit road. The logic here is absolute equality of resource access.
So if everyone builds their house in a single file line along the riverbank, nobody gets shut out from the water.
Exactly. Everyone has equal access to water for irrigation, for fishing, and for transporting their goods to market via boat. You see this beautifully illustrated in the historic river settlements of Quebec, Canada, stretching along the St. Lawrence River and down in the bayous of Louisiana.
Which brings up a fascinating question. The Earth doesn't naturally have property lines. How do governments actually draw the borders that create these patterns? How is property legally defined in the dirt?
That is determined by land survey systems. The government imposes a mathematical or physical logic onto the landscape. There are three major systems you need to know for the exam. First is the metes and bounds system. This was brought over by British colonists.
I read about this and it seems almost comically chaotic.
It can be. Metes and bounds uses natural physical features, like a specific ancient oak tree, a large boulder, or the bend of a creek, along with compass directions to draw property lines. A deed might literally say, from the large gray rock, walk north 100 paces to the edge of the stream.
But what happens if the stream dries up, or lightning strikes the oak tree, or someone just moves the rock?
That is exactly why it caused endless legal disputes. Because nature isn't perfectly straight or permanent, this system results in highly irregular, chaotic plots of land. If you look at a property map of New England today, it looks like a jigsaw puzzle drawn by a child. There are no straight lines.
So how did America transition from that chaotic puzzle to those perfect, boring squares we see when flying over Iowa?
That transition was driven by the township and range system. After the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson and the U.S. federal government needed a way to survey, divide, and sell the massive new Western territories quickly and efficiently. They realized metes and bounds was too slow, so they completely ignored the natural geography, the hills, and the streams, and instead dropped a rigid mathematical grid of latitude and longitude over the entire landscape.
They just laid a giant checkerboard over the continent.
Essentially, yes. They divided land into perfect 6-mile by 6-mile squares called townships, and then divided those into 1 square mile sections. It created perfect rectangular plots, resulting in that classic, endlessly repeating grid pattern that defines the American Midwest and West. It allowed the government to sell land sight unseen to pioneers back east.
Finally, we have the long lot system.
This is deeply tied to French colonial influence, which is why we see it in Quebec and Louisiana. This system divides land into very narrow, incredibly long strips that all extend back from a central resource, usually a river.
This goes back to the linear settlement idea. It prevents one wealthy landowner from buying up a massive square block of riverfront property and monopolizing the water, shutting out everyone behind him.
Correct. Every single farm gets a narrow slice of riverfront, and their property stretches far back into the woods or the plains. It ensures fair, democratic access to the most vital transportation and irrigation artery.
What I love about this is that a geographer can look at a satellite map today and tell you who colonized a region hundreds of years ago just by looking at the shapes of the farms. If it's wonky, it was the British. If it's a grid, it was the early U.S. government. If it looks like piano keys along a river, it was the French.
That illustrates a brilliant geographic concept called sequent occupants. It's the idea that successive societies leave their permanent cultural and physical stamp on a landscape.
Yeah.
Even if the French left Louisiana centuries ago, the long lot system is physically baked into the dirt and the property needs today. The past is visible in the present geometry.
That is such a cool cheat code for reading a map. Let's shift gears now to the absolute core of agricultural economic geography. Bid-rent theory, covered in topic 5.6. This is the math of farming. The basic rule of bid-rent theory is that land value decreases as your distance from the central business district, or the CBD, increases.
To understand this, just think about renting an apartment. The CBD is the bustling downtown heart of the city. If you want an apartment right downtown, walking distance to all the jobs and restaurants, you are going to pay an astronomical rent for a tiny studio. But if you are willing to commute an hour out into the deep suburbs, that same amount of money rents you a huge 4-bedroom house.
Because everyone wants to be near the center, so the price gets bid up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, apply that to farmers. The CBD is where the central market is. Land right next to the city is incredibly expensive. Land 50 miles out is dirt cheap. So a farmer faces a critical economic choice. If they buy land close to the CBD, they are paying a fortune for a tiny plot. Therefore, they are forced to practice intensive agriculture. They have to grow high-value, highly perishable goods on that small space to turn a profit.
Things like dairy or fresh strawberries or delicate flowers. Because if I am growing strawberries 50 miles out in the country and I have to transport them in the back of a slow, hot wagon, they are going to spoil. They become mush before I ever reach a buyer, so I pay the massive premium for the close land to save on transport time and spoilage.
Precisely. But if you move far away from the CBD, the land is cheap. You can buy thousands of acres. This allows for extensive farming of products that aren't highly perishable and are cheap to transport, like massive fields of wheat, which can sit in a sack for months, or cattle, which can literally walk themselves to the market.
And this apartment hunting logic is the foundation of one of the most famous, heavily tested models in all of human geography, the von Thunen model, covered in topic 5.8. Johann Heinrich von Thunen was a 19th century Prussian farmer and economist. He created a spatial model to predict exactly where specific agricultural activities would take place around a city.
To make his math work, von Thunen had to create a theoretical laboratory. He established a set of strict assumptions to isolate the two main variables he cared about: transportation cost and perishability.
Let's set the stage of this 19th century laboratory. First, he assumed an isolated state, meaning there's only one single market city in the center and no outside trade with other countries. Second, he assumed the land was an isotropic plain. I love that term. What does it mean?
An isotropic plain is the geographer's perfect, featureless void. It assumes the land is completely flat, extending infinitely in all directions. There are no mountains to cross, no rivers to navigate around, nothing to alter the cost of transport. He also assumed the soil fertility and climate were exactly equal everywhere.
And crucially, he assumed there was only one mode of transport. In 1826, that was an ox pulling a heavy wooden cart down a dirt road.
Under those very specific laboratory conditions, von Thunen calculated that agricultural production would organize itself into 4 distinct concentric rings radiating outward around the central market city.
Let's walk through the rings. Ring 1, the closest ring to the city, is dedicated to dairy and market gardening. Why?
Spoilage. Before refrigeration, milk goes bad in a matter of hours in the summer heat. Fresh vegetables wilt. They must reach the market immediately. The high market value of these fresh goods justifies the farmer paying the incredibly expensive land rent of Ring 1.
Okay, Ring 2 always trips people up. Ring 2 is forestry. Wait, why would a wild forest be closer to the city than a field of food?
You have to put yourself in the mindset of an 1820s Prussian city. Wood was their oil, their electricity, and their concrete. It was the primary source of fuel for heating homes and cooking, and the primary building material. Timber is incredibly heavy and bulky. Imagine loading massive oak logs onto a wooden cart pulled by an ox. It is painfully slow and incredibly expensive to transport over long distances. Therefore, purely to minimize those crushing transport costs, the heavy forest had to be located relatively close to the city in Ring 2.
I hadn't considered the sheer weight of the wood. That makes perfect sense. Then we move out to Ring 3, which is field crops and grains, like wheat and barley.
Grains are much lighter than massive logs, and they are not highly perishable like milk. Wheat travels very well and can be stored indefinitely. Therefore, the farmer doesn't need to be right next to the city. They can afford to grow grains further out in Ring 3, where they can buy the massive tracts of cheap land required to grow wheat profitably.
Finally, we reach the outermost edge of civilization, Ring 4, which is ranching and livestock.
Raising a herd of cattle requires massive amounts of grazing land. That sheer acreage is only affordable at the furthest edges of the model where land is practically given away. Furthermore, livestock possess a unique transport advantage. They are self-transporting. You don't have to load a cow onto an ox cart. The cowboy simply herds the cow, and the cow walks itself to the central slaughterhouse in the city. The fact that the animal provides its own transportation drastically reduces costs, entirely offsetting the vast distance of Ring 4.
Now, obviously, we don't live in a 19th century Prussian laboratory. We don't use ox carts, and the Earth is not a perfectly flat plain. How does the modern world break von Thunen's model?
The biggest disruptors are modern transportation technology and globalization. The invention of refrigeration, what geographers call cool chains, completely shatters the perishability constraint. Today, a refrigerated cargo ship can transport delicate Chilean grapes or New Zealand lamb thousands of miles to a supermarket in New York without spoiling. We don't live in an isolated state. We live in a hyper-globalized market where climate often dictates production more than distance to a specific city. Avocados are grown in Mexico because the climate is right, regardless of how far they have to travel to reach a buyer in Canada.
But the curriculum notes point out something fascinating. Despite all these modern realities, the von Thunen model actually still applies remarkably well to the United States on a macro scale.
It does. If you look at a map of the United States and treat the heavily populated, urbanized East Coast from Boston down to Washington, D.C. as the single central business district, the model largely holds up. Ring 1, the intense dairy farming, is concentrated right next door in upstate New York, Pennsylvania, and the Great Lakes region. Ring 3, the massive field crops like corn and wheat, are located further out in the expansive plains of the Midwest. And Ring 4, cattle and sheep ranching, dominates the cheap, arid, expansive lands of the far west.
It also works on a micro scale. Think about your local weekend farmer's market. The entire premise is that highly perishable, expensive artisanal goods like heirloom tomatoes and goat cheese are grown on small, intensive plots just a few miles outside the city center to guarantee ultimate freshness.
For the listener taking the AP exam, do not just memorize the order of the 4 rings. That is a trap. You must be able to explain the economic logic behind the rings. If you want to absolutely nail the von Thunen FRQ, follow the money. It's all about balancing the high cost of land near the city against the cost of transporting heavy or perishable goods in an ox cart. If you explain that balance, you get the points.
That is the ultimate insider tip. Let's transition into segment 3, the modern global economy of agriculture, diving into topics 5.7 and 5.9. We've spent a lot of time mapping out how things used to be organized in history and in theory. Now let's look at the behemoth that is the modern agricultural economy. And that starts with understanding the fundamental shift from subsistence to commercial agriculture.
It is a critical distinction based on the core purpose of the farm. Subsistence agriculture is farming primarily to feed the farmer, their immediate family, and their local community. The goal is survival. A subsistence farmer often grows a wide variety of crops and raises a few different animals on a small plot to ensure they have a balanced diet throughout the year. If they have a small surplus, they might trade it locally, but they are not integrated into global markets.
And geographically, where are we still seeing this?
This is primarily practiced in the periphery, in developing countries across parts of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Contrast that with commercial agriculture. The primary goal of commercial farming is to maximize financial profit by selling crops off the farm, usually into global markets. It is large-scale, highly mechanized, reliant on chemical inputs, and predominantly found in core developed countries.
When we talk about these massive commercial farms, we need to do a quick terminology check. You might hear the words monocropping and monoculture used, and they sound identical, but there is a nuance.
Monocropping is the practice of growing the exact same cash crop, like corn or soybeans, indefinitely on one single plot of land, year after year. It is highly profitable in the short term, but devastating to soil nutrients. Monoculture is growing one crop at a time in a massive field, but the farmer rotates it. So you might grow a 500-acre field of corn this year, but next year you rotate that entire field to soybeans to help manage pests and soil health.
And these practices are the hallmarks of a massive shift in the developed world, the rise of agribusiness. I think a lot of us still have a romanticized vision in our heads of the small American family farm with a red barn and a few cows. But the economic reality is starkly different.
It is an industrial reality now. In the United States, for instance, nearly 90% of farms are technically classified as family-owned. However, those small family farms only produce about 20% of the total agricultural output. The vast, overwhelming majority of the food produced and sold is dominated by massive corporate agribusinesses. Their entire focus is treating the farm like a factory floor, maximizing efficiency, integrating technology, and generating immense profits.
But how do they actually squeeze the small farmer out so effectively? Why can't the guy with the red barn compete? It comes down to two concepts: economies of scale and vertical integration. Let's break those down.
Economies of scale is a fundamental business principle. It simply means that the larger your operation is, the cheaper it costs you to produce each individual unit. If I am a small farmer with a 50-acre plot, I still have to buy a tractor, buy seeds, and pay for fuel. My cost to produce 1 ear of corn is relatively high.
But if I am a corporate agribusiness,
If you are an agribusiness with a 10,000-acre farm, a fleet of GPS-guided automated combine harvesters, and bulk purchasing power for fertilizer, your cost to produce that same ear of corn drops to pennies. The small farmer simply cannot compete on the wholesale price.
to understand how agribusiness truly dominates, we have to look beyond the dirt and look at commodity chains. What is a commodity chain?
A commodity chain is the entire complex path a product takes from the seed in the dirt to the consumer's plate. It has several distinct stages. First is production at the farm. Second is processing at an industrial plant. Third is distribution via trucks, trains, or refrigerated ships. Fourth is retail at a grocery store or restaurant. And finally, consumption.
From the field to the fork. Now, how do massive corporations manipulate this chain to win?
They utilize vertical integration. Let's use McDonald's French fries as a hypothetical example. Traditionally, a restaurant buys potatoes from a distributor who bought them from a processing plant who bought them from a farmer. Everyone in that chain takes cut of the profit.
Right, there are three middlemen marking up the price.
Exactly. But under vertical integration, a mega corporation will simply buy out the entire chain. They purchase the massive potato farms in Idaho. They build and own the processing plant that cuts and flash freezes the fries. They own the logistics company with refrigerated trucks. By owning every single stage of the commodity chain, they bypass external suppliers and middlemen completely. This allows them to slash their internal costs, control the quality at every step, and completely dominate the retail market.
That is brilliant, but kind of terrifying for anyone trying to compete. This brings us to a really intense reality check in topic 5.9, global interdependence. Because agribusiness operates on a global scale, we see a very rigid core-periphery relationship forming across the world map.
The dynamic is quite simple. The periphery grows the raw agricultural materials, and the core buys, processes, and consumes them. Think about a chocolate bar. The cacao beans were almost certainly grown in the tropical climate of the Ivory Coast or Ghana in West Africa. But that raw cacao is shipped away. It is processed, turned into an expensive branded chocolate bar, and consumed in the European Union or the United States. The real profit is made in the processing and retail stages, which are controlled by the core countries.
This sounds like neocolonialism. Let's define that quickly, because we often think of colonialism as ancient history involving galleons and kings, but you're saying it's still happening in the grocery store aisle.
Neocolonialism refers to the economic strings that are still attached long after the colonial flags changed and countries declared independence. During the colonial era, European powers physically forced their colonies in Africa, Latin America, and Asia to focus entirely on growing specific raw cash crops, like cotton, rubber, or sugar, to feed European factories. Even after these nations gained independence, their entire physical infrastructure and economy were hardwired to export that one raw material to the West. They struggle to break free from that structure today because they lack the capital to build their own processing factories.
And this creates a deeply vulnerable economic condition known as commodity dependence. This is when a developing country's entire national economy relies perilously heavily on the export of just one or two agricultural products. The sources highlight an incredible, heartbreaking case study: Madagascar.
Madagascar is the perfect example of commodity dependence. They produce nearly 2/3 of the entire world's supply of vanilla. That single crop accounts for roughly 10% of their entire national GDP.
On paper, having a monopoly on vanilla sounds great, but what happens when the weather doesn't cooperate with that single crop?
Total disaster. When a country is that dependent on one crop, they are completely at the mercy of factors entirely outside their control. Between 2016 and 2019, Severe cyclones hit Madagascar and destroyed massive swaths of the vanilla crop. Because they lacked a diversified economy to fall back on, that single weather event caused billions of dollars in lost revenue, devastating the incomes of thousands of small farmers and plunging an already impoverished population deeper into crisis.
And it's not just weather. If global consumer preferences suddenly shift, or if a lab invents a cheaper synthetic vanilla flavoring that companies prefer, Madagascar's national economy collapses overnight.
The global system is also highly vulnerable to system shocks. Political trade wars can upend global agriculture in a week. In 2018, there was a major tariff dispute between the United States and China. In retaliation, China simply stopped buying U.S. soybeans. Almost overnight, American farmers had a massive, rotting surplus of crops they couldn't sell, causing widespread bankruptcies despite a perfect growing season.
Physical infrastructure is also a massive gatekeeper to this global market.
Absolutely. If a developing country can grow an amazing surplus of tomatoes, but they don't have paved roads to get them to a port or access to reliable electricity for refrigerated shipping containers, those tomatoes rot in the sun. They are entirely locked out of the global market, leading to localized poverty even in the midst of agricultural abundance.
So how does this translate to the AP exam? What is the cheat code here?
FRQs frequently test your ability to connect agriculture to levels of economic development. If a prompt describes a region heavily reliant on subsistence farming, high manual labor inputs, or a state of commodity dependence on a single cash crop, you must confidently identify that as peripheral or semi-peripheral development. Conversely, if the prompt describes heavy mechanization, vertical integration, and complex commodity chains, you are looking at a core developed nation. Follow the technology and the supply chain.
That brings us into the final stretch, segment 4, impacts, challenges, and social dynamics. We are looking at topics 5.10, 5.1, and 5.12. Humanity produces an astronomical amount of food today, but it comes at a very real, very heavy cost to the planet and to society. Let's start with the environmental consequences. Every single time humans farm, we alter the physical landscape.
We discussed slash and burn earlier as a subsistence method. But when that same method is driven by massive, unrelenting commercial demand, the results are catastrophic. Look at the clear cutting of immense tropical rainforests in Indonesia and Malaysia to make way for commercial palm oil plantations. It leads to devastating deforestation, massive loss of critical biodiversity like the orangutan, and it directly alters global climate patterns by removing the trees that absorb carbon.
What about altering the shape of the land? I've seen pictures of those beautiful stair-step farms in the mountains of Asia.
That is terrace farming. Farmers cut flat steps into steep hillsides in places like the Himalayas, Southeast Asia, or the Andes Mountains. If managed well, it's highly sustainable. It prevents soil erosion and allows irrigation water to pool on the steps rather than rushing down the mountain. But if a region undergoes rapid urbanization and the younger generation leaves the farm, those terraces are abandoned. Without constant maintenance, the retaining walls collapse during the monsoon, leading to massive, deadly mudslides.
Water management is another massive human intervention. In Europe, the Netherlands famously drained their wetlands and coastal areas to reclaim 20% of their current landmass from the sea to create new farmland.
Historically, reclaiming land seemed like a triumph of engineering over nature. But modern ecology now understands that wetlands are critical ecosystems. They act as natural sponges that prevent flooding and natural filters that clean water. When we drain them for row crops, we lose all those ecological services.
And on the flip side, bringing water to dry areas through intensive irrigation can be just as catastrophic. The notes point to the Aral Sea as the prime example.
The Aral Sea in Central Asia is one of the worst human-made environmental disasters in history. The Soviet Union decided they wanted to turn the arid steppes of Central Asia into a massive hub for commercial cotton farming, a crop that requires immense amounts of water. So they diverted the two major rivers that fed the Aral Sea to irrigate the desert cotton fields.
What happened to the sea?
Without the rivers replenishing it, it simply evaporated. Between the 1960s and the 2000s, the Aral Sea saw a catastrophic reduction in its surface area, shrinking to a fraction of its original size. It left behind thousands of square miles of toxic, salty, pesticide-laced seabed. The wind now whips that toxic dust into the air, causing terrible respiratory diseases in the local population. They destroyed an entire sea just to grow cotton in a desert.
That is sobering. Speaking of salt, let's talk about the invisible chemical impacts of farming. What is soil salinization?
Soil salinization happens heavily in arid regions when farmers over-irrigate. They pump groundwater onto the fields, but because the climate is so hot and dry, the water evaporates into the air very rapidly. All water has trace amounts of natural salts in it. When the water evaporates, it leaves that salt behind on the topsoil. Over the years, a crust of white salt builds up, literally poisoning the soil until nothing can grow.
We also see the expansion of farms threatening nomadic communities, leading to desertification.
As governments fence off more and more land for commercial fixed farms, nomadic herders are confined to smaller and smaller grazing areas. Because they can't move freely, their herds overgraze the remaining land. They eat every blade of grass down to the roots. Without the roots holding the soil together, the wind blows the fertile topsoil away, turning previously viable land into useless, expanding desert. That is desertification.
All of this destruction feeds directly into the contemporary debates covered in Topic 5.11. The core conflict of modern agriculture seems to be this. We absolutely must produce enough food to feed a booming global population approaching 8 billion people, but the intensive methods we use to achieve those high yields are destroying the soil and water we need to survive in the future.
Technology is right at the center of this debate. Let's look at biotech, specifically GMOs. Genetically modified organisms are engineered in laboratories to resist severe drought, survive specific chemical weed killers, and produce massive yields.
What are the arguments on both sides?
The pro-GMO side argues that as climate change makes weather more unpredictable, we absolutely need crops engineered to survive drought and heat, or millions will starve. The yield per acre is unparalleled. The con side, however, argues that GMOs lock farmers into expensive contracts with chemical companies, reduce the genetic diversity of our food supply, and create unknown long-term ecological risks by introducing synthetic DNA into the wild ecosystem.
We see a similar intense debate with aquaculture, or fish farms. As the global middle class grows, the demand for animal protein is skyrocketing. The oceans are being overfished. So we started farming fish in giant underwater cages.
Aquaculture is heavily practiced in coastal areas of Southeast Asia and Norway. It provides a vital, incredibly high-yield source of protein without depleting wild ocean stocks. However, cramming tens of thousands of salmon into a small net pen generates immense amounts of concentrated fish waste, which pollutes the surrounding water. Diseases spread rapidly in those crowded conditions, requiring heavy use of antibiotics, which then seep into the local marine ecosystem.
But consumers aren't just sitting by and accepting the industrial model. There's massive pushback. We're seeing a huge rise in alternative agricultural models focusing on sustainability.
Organic farming is booming. It strictly avoids synthetic chemical fertilizers and pesticides, relying on natural crop rotation and biological pest control to heal the soil. We are also seeing a massive rise in urban farming.
Right. The curriculum notes that in some Chinese megacities, urban farming, growing food on rooftops, in vacant lots, or in vertical greenhouses, supplies an astonishing 90% of the fresh vegetables for the local population.
It drastically reduces the transportation distance, bringing the von Thunen model inside the city limits. You also have the rise of CSAs, or community-supported agriculture, where locals buy a seasonal subscription directly from a local farmer, guaranteeing them a steady income and bypassing the corporate commodity chain entirely.
And the fair trade movement is crucial to mention. This is when consumers in the core deliberately choose to pay a premium price for goods like coffee, chocolate, or bananas, specifically to ensure that the peripheral farmers who grew it are paid a living wage rather than being exploited by the multinational distributors.
Yet, despite all this incredible production, despite the green revolution and organic movements, we face a tragic global irony. We overproduce food on a planetary scale. We throw away millions of tons of food, yet widespread, agonizing hunger persists.
Which highlights the grim reality that modern hunger is a distribution failure, not a production failure. We have the food, we just don't get it to the people who need it.
That leads to food insecurity, where populations suffer from unbalanced diets, often relying on cheap, calorie-dense but nutrient-poor processed foods because fresh food is too expensive.
This brings us to food deserts. Let's clarify what that means, because it sounds like a place where no food grows, like the Sahara.
A food desert is actually about geographic access. You could be living in the middle of a bustling, densely populated urban neighborhood in Chicago or in a highly rural county in Appalachia. But if the only place within a mile of your home that sells food is a gas station or a convenience store selling chips and soda, and you don't own a car to drive to a massive supermarket in the suburbs, you are living in a food desert. You have zero access to fresh, affordable nutrition.
And compounding all of these spatial issues is the reality of suburbanization. As our cities sprawl outward, building endless subdivisions and strip malls, they are literally paving over the most valuable, fertile farmland, the very soil needed to feed those growing cities.
Finally, we must discuss a critical demographic topic that the AP exam heavily emphasizes. Topic 5.1, Women in Agriculture. The geographic variations here are profound and revealing.
Who is actually doing the physical work of farming globally?
In periphery, subsistence-based systems, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia, women are the undisputed backbone of agricultural production. They provide between 60 to 80% of the manual labor required to grow the community's food crops.
But the statistics look very different in developed countries.
In core developed countries, the historic rise of heavy mechanization during the Second Agricultural Revolution initially pushed women out of the fields, as the cultural assumption was that operating massive tractors was men's work. However, that trend is currently reversing in the core. Women are increasingly returning to agriculture, frequently taking leadership roles within agribusiness management, agricultural sciences, and spearheading the localized organic farming movements.
But if we look back at the periphery, the curriculum raises a vital point about systemic inequality. The labor numbers don't match the power dynamics.
We can look at the Republic of the Congo as a stark, illustrated example of this. In the Congo, women produce roughly 75% of the total agricultural output. They're doing the vast majority of the planting and harvesting. Yet, due to systemic traditional legal barriers, they are effectively barred from legally owning the land they farm.
That is staggering. They produce 75% of the country's food, but have zero legal ownership of the dirt they are standing on.
It is a profound injustice, and it creates a brutal economic ripple effect. Because these women lack land rights, they have no collateral. Without collateral, they cannot secure bank loans. Without credit, they cannot buy advanced seeds, they cannot afford fertilizers, and they cannot purchase small machinery to increase their efficiency.
So the systemic sexism is literally keeping the crop yields artificially low.
It's exactly. Global research consistently shows that this gender inequality directly depresses agricultural productivity. The United Nations estimates that if you simply empower women in these regions with equal land rights and resource access, farm yields would rise significantly. That increase alone would pull over 100 million people out of hunger.
So if I'm a student taking the AP exam and I encounter an FRQ regarding food security, global hunger, or development levels, connecting the solution to gender equity seems like the ultimate analytical cheat code.
It is a highly sophisticated, high-scoring move. If you can argue that empowering women with property rights and credit access directly enhances global food security and raises a nation's development level, you are demonstrating a master-level grasp of human geography.
Wow. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. If you have stayed with us through this deep dive, take a breath and congratulate yourself. You have just absorbed the foundational mechanisms of how humanity feeds itself, from the first seeds in the Fertile Crescent to the corporate boardrooms of modern agribusiness.
Let me reiterate the stakes one last time as you review your notes. Unit 5 is 12 to 17% of your AP exam. You are highly likely to see FRQs asking you to apply the von Thunen model to modern scenarios, to compare the demographic impacts of the 3 agricultural revolutions, to link farming practices to core periphery development levels, and to analyze the environmental consequences of the Green Revolution.
What is your final piece of advice for the listener as they head into test prep?
Make this real. Don't let these just be terms in a textbook. The next time you walk into your local grocery store, look at a piece of fruit or a bag of coffee. Remember that every single item on those shelves represents a complex global web of history, economics, and human geography. It represents a specific land survey system, a meticulously engineered commodity chain, a climate classification, and an environmental trade-off. If you can see the world through that interconnected lens, you are more than ready for this exam.
I love that. And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over as you close your books today. We spend a lot of time on von Thunen's model, which is entirely based on the cost of transporting physical goods across land to a physical market. But look at the headlines coming out of tech labs today. How will the rise of lab-grown meat, which requires 0 acres of ranching land, disrupt that model? How will massive vertical indoor farming inside city center skyscrapers or direct-to-consumer drone deliveries that ignore roads entirely completely shatter and redraw the geographic map of human agriculture? The first 3 revolutions completely changed the world. Are we standing on the edge of the 4th agricultural revolution right now? Think about it. Good luck on your exam, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.